She was reported missing on a quiet weekday morning. No sign of a struggle. No broken doors. No obvious reason for panic. Just a message. A husband calling police, saying his wife was gone. At first, it sounded ordinary. The kind of case officers respond to every day. A missing adult. Possibly left on her own. Possibly needed space. Possibly nothing serious. That is how these cases usually begin. With uncertainty. With calm voices. With explanations that feel reasonable enough to accept. But something about this call was different. Not obvious. Not enough to raise immediate alarm. Just a tone. A pace. A version of events that felt slightly prepared. He said he woke up and she wasn't there. He said her phone was off. He said he had tried calling, texting, waiting, and when she didn't respond, he got worried. So he called police. Everything about that story made sense. On the surface. Because people do go missing. People leave. People disconnect. But investigators are trained to notice something most people ignore. Not just what is said, how it is said, and more importantly, what is missing from the story. Because real panic is messy. It interrupts sentences. It creates confusion. It sounds like someone thinking out loud. His story didn't sound like that. It sounded complete, clean, like it had already been arranged before it was spoken. That was the first small crack. The kind you don't notice unless you're looking for it. Officers arrived at the home. A normal house. Quiet neighborhood. Nothing out of place. No broken windows. No forced entry. No visible signs of violence. Inside, everything looked still. Too still. The kind of stillness that doesn't match a sudden disappearance. Her shoes were by the door. Her purse was still inside. Keys untouched. The small details that matter in missing person cases. Because when someone leaves by choice, they take things. When someone disappears without those things, it means something else. And that realization begins quietly. It doesn't turn into accusation immediately. It turns into focus. Because now the question changes. Not where did she go? But did she leave at all? The husband stayed calm. Answered questions. Walked officers through the house. Explained routines. Explained their relationship. Explained that things had been normal. No major arguments. No problems worth mentioning. That word matters. Normal. Because in cases like this, normal becomes a shield. A way to make everything seem stable. Even when it is. Neighbors were asked if they saw anything. Heard anything. Anyone unusual. Most said no. Quiet night. Nothing out of place. And that should have helped his story. But instead, it made it heavier. Because silence can work both ways. If no one saw her leave, then how did she leave? That is where investigators begin building timelines. Not based on what people say, based on what can be proven. Last confirmed sighting, last phone activity, last movement. And very quickly, one thing became clear. No one had seen her leave. No cameras, no witnesses, no messages, no activity, nothing. She had simply stopped existing in the timeline. That is not how voluntary disappearance looks. That is how interruption looks. And interruption means something happened. Inside that house, or just outside it. The husband continued cooperating. But cooperation is not proof. It is just behavior. And behavior can be controlled, especially by someone who believes they are ahead of the situation. That is what investigators started to consider. Because sometimes the person calling for help already knows what happened, and the call itself is part of the story, part of the setup, part of the timeline they want police to believe. That possibility changes everything, because now every detail is examined differently. The call, the timing, the words, even the pause between sentences. Everything becomes evidence. And evidence does not care about appearances. It only cares about consistency. If you're interested in real cases like this, the ones where the smallest detail changes everything, subscribe now, because this story is about to shift in a way no one expects. Because what police found next did not match anything he said. Once the initial walkthrough of the house was done, the tone of the investigation changed. Not dramatically, not in a way the husband could immediately see. But inside the minds of the officers standing there, something had already shifted. Because everything was too clean. Not clean in a reassuring way. Clean in a controlled way. No signs of forced entry. No signs of a struggle. No indication that someone had come from the outside. Which leaves only one possibility investigators always consider next. Someone already inside. Or someone who was allowed in. That is where the focus begins to narrow. Quietly, without accusation, without confrontation, just attention. The husband continued explaining. He said they had dinner the night before. He said everything felt normal. He said they went to bed. And when he woke up, she was gone. He repeated that version more than once. And repetition matters. Because when a story is repeated exactly the same way, it can feel rehearsed. Real memory shifts slightly. Small details change. Sequence adjusts. But his story stayed the same. Clean. Simple. Contained. Investigators took note. Not as proof. As pattern. Because patterns are what break cases open later. Then came the next step. They asked about her phone. Still off. No recent messages. No outgoing calls. No movement. That alone raised concern. Because in modern cases, phones rarely disappear without leaving something behind. Even a ping. Even a brief connection. But here there was nothing. Like the device had been removed from the timeline entirely. That detail matters more than most people realize. Because phones are witnesses. They record movement, interaction, presence. When a phone goes silent at the exact moment a person disappears, it is rarely coincidence. And that silence becomes one of the strongest indicators something is wrong. Then investigators looked at the car, still in the driveway, undisturbed. If she had left willingly, she would have taken it. If someone had taken her, there would likely be signs. But there were none. Again clean. Again controlled. That pattern was repeating. And repetition is what turns suspicion into direction. The officers did not accuse him. They did not push aggressively. They let him talk. Because people reveal more when they feel comfortable. And comfort creates mistakes. Small ones at first. Changes in wording. shifts in timing, details that don't align. And those details started appearing. He mentioned a conversation the night before, then later described it differently. He said they had no issues, then referenced tension. Not directly, just enough to create inconsistency. That is how cracks begin. Not with major contradictions, with small differences. And small differences become large when placed next to evidence. Because while he was talking, investigators were already doing something else. They were building a timeline, not based on his words, based on data, phone records, security cameras, movement patterns. And that is where things began to break. A nearby camera picked up movement late at night. Not clearly, not enough to identify a person, but enough to show activity. Activity that did not match his version of events. That mattered, because now there was something external. Something that could not be controlled by his explanation. And once external evidence enters a case, the narrative starts losing power. Because evidence does not adjust. It stays exactly as it is. They asked him about the timing. He explained, but his explanation did not fully match what the footage suggested. Another small crack. Still not enough to accuse, but enough to keep pushing. Then came the question every investigator eventually asks. When was the last time you saw her? He answered, but this time there was hesitation. A pause. Not long, but noticeable. That pause matters, because hesitation often appears when someone is choosing between truth and version. And choosing creates delay. Investigators notice delay. They don't interrupt it. They let it exist, because it tells them where to look next. The house was searched again, more carefully this time, looking not for obvious signs, but for absence. What was missing? What had been moved? What didn't belong? And that is when they found it. Not something large, not something dramatic, something small, something easy to overlook. But in investigations, small things carry weight. A mark, out of place, subtle, but not accidental. At first glance, it could be ignored. But once you know what to look for, it becomes something else. Possible evidence, possible indication, possible beginning of a much darker explanation. They documented it, photographed it, did not react, because reaction can alert the wrong person. Instead, they kept the same tone, the same calm, the same pace, and let the investigation move forward. The husband did not realize the shift. He believed he was still ahead of the situation, still controlling the narrative, still presenting a version that made sense. But what he didn't know was this. The investigation was no longer trying to find his wife. It was trying to understand what happened to her. And those are two very different things. Because once police believe something happened, they stop looking outward and start looking inward, at the people closest, at the ones with access, at the ones with opportunity. And he was at the center of all three. The question was no longer if something was wrong. The question was how much he knew, and whether his version would survive what they were about to find next. Because the small mark inside the house was only the beginning. The moment investigators document something out of place inside a home, the entire investigation shifts. Quietly, but permanently. Because now there is physical evidence. Not a story, not an assumption, something real, something that can be tested, something that can contradict a person's version of events. The small mark they found did not look dramatic. It wasn't obvious violence, but it wasn't normal either. It was the kind of detail that doesn't belong in a routine morning. And that's what made it important. Because cases like this are not solved by big discoveries at the beginning. They are solved by small things that refuse to fit. The husband continued talking, explaining, trying to keep the narrative simple. But simple stories struggle when evidence begins to grow. Investigators asked him again about the previous night. What time did you go to bed? What did you do before that? Did anything unusual happen? This time, his answers changed slightly. Not enough for someone listening casually to notice, but enough for trained investigators to recognize inconsistency. Time shifted, sequence shifted, details became less certain. That is how pressure begins to show. Not through confession, through instability. Because maintaining a false timeline requires perfect recall. And perfect recall is almost impossible under questioning, especially when the timeline itself is built on something that didn't actually happen. At the same time, investigators began expanding beyond the house. They spoke again with neighbors, checked additional cameras, looked at traffic movement, because even when something happens inside, there is usually a point where it crosses outside. Movement, transport, something that connects the inside to the outside world. And eventually, they found it. Another camera, not directly facing the house, but angled enough to catch part of the street. It didn't show a clear image. No faces, no obvious identification, but it showed motion. Late at night, a vehicle, positioned longer than expected. That detail mattered, because it created a question. If she left on her own, why was there unexplained movement outside the house? And if someone came from outside, why was there no sign of entry? Those two possibilities did not match, which means there was a third. Something that connected both. Something that had access inside and movement outside. That is when the focus becomes very specific. Because in most cases like this, the answer is not complicated. It is uncomfortable. Someone inside the story is not telling the truth. And once investigators reach that conclusion, everything changes. The questions become sharper. The tone becomes more direct. The timeline becomes more precise. They asked him again about the early morning. When did you wake up? What did you do first? Did you leave the house? Did anyone come over? This time, the pauses were longer. The answers less certain. Because now, he was not just telling a story. He was reacting to pressure. And pressure reveals behavior. Behavior reveals truth. Even without a confession. Investigators also checked his phone. Not just calls and messages. Location data. Movement patterns. Background activity. Phones record more than people realize, even when not actively used. And what they found began to matter, because his phone showed activity at times that did not fully match what he said. Movement inside the house. Movement outside the house. Timing that felt slightly off. Not completely wrong, but not perfectly aligned either. And that is enough. Because cases don't break when everything is obviously false. They break when things don't line up exactly. Small differences create large problems. Because once one part of the story fails, the rest becomes questionable. Then came another detail. The back area of the house. Less visible, less obvious, but connected. Investigators noticed something there too. A disturbance. Not large, but present. The kind of disturbance that suggests movement. Something being moved. Something passing through. That detail connected to the earlier finding inside. Front, back, inside, outside. Now the pattern was forming. Not complete, but forming. And once a pattern begins, investigators follow it. Step by step. They didn't accuse him. Not yet. Because accusation too early can shut everything down. Instead, they let him continue. Let him explain. Let him stay inside the version he had created. Because the longer someone stays inside a false version, the harder it becomes to adjust it later. And that is when mistakes happen. More questions came. About their relationship. About stress. About recent arguments. He admitted there had been some tension, but minimized it. Said it wasn't serious. Said nothing that would explain her leaving suddenly. That answer created another problem. Because if nothing was wrong, then why did she leave? And if something was wrong, why wasn't he saying it clearly? Either way, the story didn't hold. Then investigators asked something simple, but powerful. Do you think she would leave without her phone? He paused, because the answer is obvious. No, but saying no breaks his story. So he hesitated. And hesitation tells investigators everything they need to know. Because at that moment, the truth and the lie cannot exist together. One has to give. And his version was starting to collapse. But the biggest shift was still coming. Because investigators were about to find something that would change the entire case. Something that could not be explained away. Something that would move this from suspicion to certainty. And once that happens, there is no going back. The shift from suspicion to certainty does not happen with noise. It happens quietly, with one piece of evidence that cannot be explained away. And in this case, that moment came from inside the house. Not from a witness, not from a camera, from something physical, something that should not have been there. Forensic teams returned with a different purpose. Not to look around, to look deeper. Because once a case crosses into possible foul play, the house stops being a home. It becomes a scene. Every surface matters. Every object matters. Every space between objects matters. That is when they found it. Not obvious, not dramatic, but undeniable. A trace, consistent with blood. Not large, not spread across the room, but present. Enough to confirm what investigators were beginning to believe. Something had happened inside that house. And now it was no longer theoretical. It was real. They tested it, documented it, did not announce it immediately. Because evidence is more powerful when it is protected. If the wrong person knows what police have, they adjust their story. So investigators stayed quiet. But internally, everything changed. Because once blood is confirmed in a missing person case, the question shifts permanently. From where is she? To what happened to her? That is the moment the investigation becomes focused. And focus narrows quickly. The husband was no longer just part of the story. He was at the center of it. They brought him in again. Same room, same calm tone. But the questions were different now. More specific, more precise, less open-ended. Can you explain how this could be there? He tried. At first, general explanations. Accidents, possibilities, something unrelated. But none of it matched. Because explanations only work when they fit evidence. And this one didn't. That is when the pressure begins to build in a way that cannot be ignored. Not aggressive, not loud, just constant. Every answer followed by another question. Every explanation tested against reality. And slowly, the gap between what he said and what existed became too large. He started adjusting. Small changes, new details, things he hadn't mentioned before. That is a sign investigators recognize immediately. Because truth does not grow under pressure. Stories do. They expand. They adapt. They try to survive. But every change makes them weaker. Because consistency is what gives a story strength. And his story was losing that. At the same time, investigators were building something else. A complete timeline. From the last confirmed moment she was seen, to the moment he called police. Every minute accounted for. Every movement mapped. And inside that timeline, there was a gap. A window of time where only one person knew what happened. Him. That is the most dangerous position in any investigation. Because when one person controls the only version of events, their credibility becomes everything. And his credibility was fading. Then came another development. His vehicle. Investigators examined it more closely. Inside, outside, under. Because vehicles connect locations. They carry evidence from one place to another. Even when cleaned. Even when someone believes they removed everything. Something remains. And something did. Not enough to tell the full story, but enough to support the pattern. Movement, transport, possibility. That is all investigators need to move forward. Because cases are not built on one piece of evidence. They are built on alignment. Multiple pieces pointing in the same direction. And everything was pointing toward him. The questioning became more direct. Did you argue? Yes. Did anything physical happen? No. But now that answer carried weight. Because it contradicted what they had found. And once a direct contradiction exists, the story begins to collapse. He felt it. You can see it in cases like this. Not always in words. In behavior. Posture changes. Breathing changes. Response time changes. Because the mind is trying to maintain control. While losing it, that is when investigators know they are close. Not to confession, to break. And breaks do not happen because someone decides to tell the truth. They happen because maintaining the lie becomes harder than admitting part of it. He began to shift again, admitting more, but still not everything, trying to stay inside a version that reduced responsibility. That is when investigators use a different approach. Not confrontation, understanding. They present possibilities. They allow space for partial truth. Because once someone admits something small, They are closer to admitting something larger. And that is what happened. He acknowledged that something went wrong, that there was a moment, an argument, escalation, but still framed it in a way that protected himself. Investigators let him talk, because talking creates opportunity. Opportunity for mistakes, opportunity for truth. And then came the moment, the one that changes everything. The moment where denial is no longer sustainable, where evidence, timeline, and pressure all meet at the same point. And when that happens, the story does not bend anymore. It breaks. And once it breaks, what comes out is no longer a version. It is the beginning of the truth. The break does not sound dramatic. There is no shouting, no sudden confession with perfect clarity. It begins quietly, with a sentence that doesn't fully commit to the truth, but moves away from the lie. I didn't mean for it to happen like that. That is how it starts. Not an admission, not a denial, a shift. And once that shift happens, investigators know they are close. Because people do not move away from a lie unless they feel it can no longer survive. He began speaking differently, less controlled, less precise, more uncertain. That change matters, because it shows the story is no longer leading the conversation. Reality is, he admitted there was an argument, more serious than he had described before, more intense, more emotional, still not complete, still not fully honest, but closer. And that is all investigators need. Because once someone steps toward the truth, even slightly, they can be guided the rest of the way. They asked him to explain, not accuse, not interrupt, just explain. And explanations reveal gaps. Gaps reveal truth. He described the moment things escalated, said it got physical, said he reacted, said it wasn't planned. That word matters. Not planned, because it attempts to frame the event as sudden, uncontrolled. But everything investigators had already found suggested something else. Control, movement, decision-making after the fact. And that contradiction is where pressure returns. Because once a person admits involvement, the focus shifts to detail. What happened next? That question is the hardest, because it forces sequence. And sequence cannot be vague. It must connect. It must align. And his version struggled to align. He described movement inside the house, but not clearly. He described actions, but avoided specifics. That avoidance is important, because people avoid what they cannot explain without exposing the full truth. Investigators let silence sit. Silence makes people uncomfortable. Uncomfortable people fill silence. And when they do, they reveal more than they intend. He continued, adding details, each one bringing the story closer to reality, but still not fully there, still protecting something. That is when investigators changed approach again. They introduced evidence. Not all of it, just enough. Help me understand how this fits. That is a powerful technique, because it forces the person to align their story with something they cannot change. And when alignment fails, the story collapses further. He tried, but the more he tried, the more obvious the gaps became. Because now it wasn't just about what happened inside the house. It was about what happened after. And that is where his version failed completely. Movement, time, Vehicle use. The back area of the house. Everything investigators had found pointed to something beyond a single moment. A sequence, and his explanation did not account for that sequence. That is when the final shift happens, the one investigators wait for. He stopped trying to maintain the original story, stopped trying to keep it controlled, and began describing what actually happened. Not perfectly, not in full detail, but enough to change the case completely. He admitted she did not leave. He admitted she never walked out of that house. He admitted he was the last person with her. And then slowly, the rest followed. What happened in the house? What happened after? How he moved her? How he tried to make it look like something else? Those details did not come all at once. They came in pieces. But each piece matched something investigators already knew. And that is how they knew it was real. Because truth aligns with evidence. It doesn't fight it. He described taking her through the house, toward the back. That matched the disturbance investigators found. He described using his vehicle. That matched the timeline and data. He described trying to remove signs. That matched the clean surfaces. Everything connected. And once everything connects, the case is no longer about proving what happened. It is about documenting it, building it, preparing it for court. But even with a confession, one question remained. The same question that appears in every case like this. Why? Why would someone do this? Why call police afterward? Why act calm? Why create a story instead of telling the truth immediately? That question is not answered by evidence. It is answered by psychology. And that is where the case becomes even more disturbing. Because the answer is rarely dramatic. It is usually simple. Control, fear, avoidance, a desire to manage consequences instead of facing them. And that is what this case revealed. Not just what happened, but how someone can move from action to concealment to performance in a matter of hours. That is what made the case impossible to ignore. Not just the crime, the behavior after. Because behavior tells a deeper story, one that goes beyond the moment. And that story was now fully visible. The husband who called police had not been searching for his wife. He had been controlling the narrative until the evidence made that impossible. Once the confession aligned with the evidence, the investigation changed again. It became structured. Everything that had been uncertain now had direction. Every piece of evidence had a place. Every timeline gap had an explanation. And when that happens, investigators stop searching for possibilities. They start confirming details. They walked through the sequence step by step. From the argument, to the moment it turned physical, to what happened afterwards. Not just to understand it, to document it. Because documentation is what turns a case into something that can stand in court. He explained how the situation escalated, how it moved from words to action, and how, once that line was crossed, everything that followed became about control. Not panic, control. That distinction matters. Because panic leads to chaos. Control leads to decisions. And decisions can be judged. He described moving her through the house, toward the back, trying to avoid detection, trying to keep things contained. That matched the disturbance investigators had found earlier. The pattern was now complete. Front, inside, back, movement from one space to another. Then he described the vehicle, using it to transport her, leaving the house, returning, trying to maintain the appearance that nothing had happened. That part is often the hardest for people to understand, because it requires a shift from action to performance, from reality to presentation, within a very short time. But it happens in cases where the focus becomes avoiding consequences rather than processing what has been done. He described cleaning, not extensively, but enough to remove obvious signs, enough to create doubt, enough to delay discovery. That delay was important, because time allows stories to form, allows explanations to be built, allows control to continue. But time also allows evidence to settle. And evidence, unlike stories, does not change. Investigators confirmed the locations, confirmed the sequence, confirmed the timeline. Everything aligned. And once everything aligns, the case becomes solid. Not based on one piece of evidence, based on many, working together, supporting each other. That is what makes a case strong. Not a confession alone, not physical evidence alone. The combination, and in this case, the combination was complete. The house, the mark, the disturbance, the vehicle, the timeline, the confession, all pointing in the same direction, all supporting the same version. And once that happens, there is no room left for doubt. Legally, the case moved quickly after that. Charges were filed. Evidence was presented. The confession was documented. There was no long public uncertainty, no extended search, because the truth had already been established. But outside the legal process, something else was happening. People were trying to understand, not just what happened, but how it happened. Because the situation did not begin with violence. It began with something ordinary. A relationship, a shared space, a routine. And within that, something changed. Something that was not visible from the outside. Something that built quietly, until it reached a point where it could not be contained. That is what makes cases like this difficult, because they do not start with obvious danger. They start with normal life, and that normal life makes it harder to recognize when something is wrong. Friends later described small changes: distance, less communication, subtle shifts in behavior, but nothing that clearly pointed to what would happen. That is often how it works. The signs are there, but they are not understood at the time. Only later, when everything is known. And by then, they are no longer signs. They are explanations. The legal outcome addressed responsibility, but it did not answer every question. It could not, because some questions are not about facts. They are about understanding. And understanding requires looking at behavior over time. Not just one moment. Why did he choose that path? Why not another? Why not leave? Why not speak? Those questions do not have simple answers, but they are the ones people keep asking, because they challenge assumptions about how people act under pressure, about how problems are resolved, about how far someone can go without showing it. And that is what stays with people. Not just the event, the realization that something like this can exist inside something that looks normal. That is what makes it unsettling, because it removes the distance. It makes it feel closer, more possible. And that is why this case stayed with so many people long after it ended. Because it was not just about what was found. It was about what had been hidden before it was found. After the arrest, the case moved quickly through the legal system. Charges were formalized. Evidence was organized. The confession was secured. From a legal standpoint, there was very little uncertainty left. He pled guilty. There was no long trial, no extended courtroom battle, no weeks of testimony. The case went directly to sentencing. Multiple life sentences. No possibility of release. Legally, it was over. But for everyone else, it was. Because cases like this don't end when the court finishes. They stay in memory, in discussion, in analysis. Because even when every fact is known, one thing remains difficult to accept: the simplicity of the situation. It didn't require an elaborate plan. It didn't involve strangers. It didn't happen far away. It happened inside a normal home, between two people who knew each other. And that is what makes it hard to process. Because people expect extreme outcomes to come from extreme situations. But this case didn't follow that pattern. It came from something ordinary. A relationship, stress, conflict, avoidance, things people experience every day. That doesn't make the outcome understandable, but it explains why it feels so close, why it stays with people, because it doesn't feel distant. It feels possible. Investigators, even after the case closed, continued reviewing behavior, not to change the outcome, but to understand it, to see what patterns might apply to other cases, to identify warning signs, even if those signs are difficult to recognize in real time. One pattern stood out clearly: avoidance. Instead of confronting problems, he avoided them. Instead of communicating, he withheld. Instead of making decisions early, he delayed. And when delay is combined with pressure, it doesn't resolve anything. It intensifies it, until the situation reaches a point where there are no easy options left. That is when extreme decisions become more likely. Not common, but possible. That pattern appears in other cases too. Not identical, but similar, which is why investigators study it. Because understanding patterns helps prevent future outcomes, even if it doesn't change what already happened. For the people directly affected, the legal outcome did not bring closure. Closure is a word people use from the outside. Inside, it feels different. There is no moment where everything feels resolved. There is only a shift. From uncertainty to certainty. From not knowing to knowing. And sometimes knowing is harder, because uncertainty allows hope, even small hope. Certainty removes it completely and replaces it with something permanent. That is what families carry. Not just loss, but the full understanding of how that loss happened. Every detail, every step. That weight does not disappear. It becomes part of life, something they move forward with, not away from. The public eventually moves on. New cases appear. New stories take attention. But for the people involved, nothing replaces it. Nothing resets the timeline. Nothing restores what was there before. That is the reality behind every case like this. Beyond headlines, beyond analysis, Beyond discussion, there is a permanent change, one that does not fade with time. And that is why these stories matter. Not because they are shocking, because they are real, and because they reveal something about behavior that people need to understand. Even if it is uncomfortable, even if it is difficult, because understanding is the only way to reduce the chance of repetition, even if it can never eliminate it completely. In the end, this case doesn't leave you with a question. It leaves you with an answer that feels harder to accept than any mystery. Because from the outside, everything looked normal. A house, a relationship, a routine. The kind of life people pass every day without thinking twice. And inside that, something changed. Not suddenly, not in a way anyone clearly saw, but gradually, quietly, until one moment turned into something irreversible. That is what makes this case stay with people. Not the complexity, the simplicity. There was no elaborate setup, no